In the cold, final hours of a Viennese night on May 5, 1741, a princess lay dying, but this was no ordinary passing. Mourned with silent tears and solemn prayers, this death was an event, a spectacle of fear and fascination. Outside the shuttered windows of the Palais Schwarzenberg, a city held its breath, not in sympathy, but in terror, for the woman within, Princess Eleonora von Schwarzenberg, had wasted away in a manner so grotesque, so unnatural, that whispers had already given her a new name. They called her a Strigoi, a name that had drifted west from the dark forests of the Balkans, Vampire 3. Her physicians, men of science and reason, in an age of enlightenment, were baffled and terrified in equal measure. Her decline had been slow and agonizing, marked by a constant, gnawing pain, a wasting of the flesh that left her skeletal, and a pallor that seemed to drink the very candlelight from the room. They had bled her, purged her, offered prayers and potions, but the affliction was relentless. It was as if she were being consumed from within. So, when her last breath rattled in her chest, it was not an end, but a beginning. The emperor's own physician, Franz von Gersdorf, demanded an immediate autopsy, a rare and intrusive procedure for a woman of her rank. But the rumors were too dangerous to ignore. What he found would not quell the whispers but set them ablaze. Deep within her abdomen, he discovered a tumor, dark and menacing, the size of a child's head. 5. The official cause of death was recorded as cervical cancer, a clinical diagnosis that did nothing to calm a populace already gripped by the great vampire epidemic raging across Eastern Europe. 4 years. Terrifying reports had been trickling in from the empire's fringes, tales of the dead rising from their graves to plague the living, of exhumed bodies found undecayed, their mouths stained with fresh blood. And now, here in the imperial heart of Vienna, was a princess whose symptoms mirrored the folk tales, a noble woman who died in a way that screamed of the unnatural. Her burial was a thing of haste and fear. She was not laid to rest in the family crypt in Vienna with her husband. 710 instead. Her body was whisked away to a provincial church in Bohemia, interred in a remote chapel, sealed behind an abnormally thick wall of masonry. 4-7. The stone over her grave bore no family name, no coat of arms, only a chillingly simple plea: "Here lies the poor sinner Eleanor. Pray for her." 710. It was an admission of shame, a quarantine of the soul. The legend had been born, a story that would echo through the centuries, of how a lonely, misunderstood princess became the monster of Vienna, the woman they called the vampire princess. But before the legend, there was a girl. Before the whispers of damnation, there was a life. To understand how the shadow of the vampire fell upon her, we must travel back, not to a crumbling crypt, but to the sun-drenched valleys of 17th century Bohemia, to a world balanced on a knife's edge between glittering reason and the darkest superstition. She was born into a world of immense privilege on a summer day in 1682. Named Eleonora Elizabeth Amalia Magdalena von Lobkowicz II, her lineage was a tapestry woven from the oldest and most powerful aristocratic families in Bohemia. 1. Her father was Prince Ferdinand August von Lobkowicz, her mother, the Margravine Maria Anna Wilhelmine of Baden-Baden. Her childhood was spent in castles where the corridors smelled of beeswax and old parchment, where the hours were marked by the chiming of chapel bells. She was raised to be a perfect jewel for the marriage market. Her education was not in science or philosophy, but in the delicate arts of nobility, comportment, piety, dance, and the elegant turns of the French language. From her earliest years, she would have understood that her body was not her own. It was an asset, a vessel for heirs, a bargaining chip in the great game of dynastic politics. Her future would be decided not by the inclinations of her heart, but by the cold calculus of her father's ambition. His eyes fell upon the house of Schwarzenberg, a family of immense wealth and influence, favored by the Holy Roman Emperor himself. The intended groom was the heir, Adam Franz von Schwarzenberg, a man known for his education, his confidence, and a touch of arrogance. 11. In the autumn of 1701, they met, a formal, chaperoned encounter arranged to finalize the alliance. What she thought of him, we will never know. What he thought of her is irrelevant. The contract was signed, the dowry negotiated. On a cold December morning, they were wed. To the ceremony was a masterpiece of Baroque splendor, a union of two of Central Europe's greatest families. To the world, it was a fairy tale. But behind the vows, a poison was already seeping into the foundations of their marriage. Adam Franz. It was whispered in the servants' quarters and behind the fans of court ladies. Had been married before. A secret union his father had swiftly annulled to make way for this more advantageous match. Eleonora, the perfect, pious princess, had married a man whose heart was already pledged to another. She had been betrayed before she had even become a wife. The Schwarzenberg castle was a cold and imposing fortress, its ancient portraits staring down with silent judgment. Here Eleanor's life settled into the rigid, suffocating routine of a highborn wife. Her days were a blur of managing household accounts, writing letters, and receiving minor courtiers. It was a gilded cage, and the bars were forged from duty and expectation. The primary duty, of course, was to produce a male heir. The months turned into years, and the nursery remained empty. The smiles of her in-laws grew thin and brittle. The silence between husband and wife stretched into a vast, frozen expanse. In 1706, after 5 years of uncertainty, she finally gave birth, but it was a daughter. Maria Anna 212. While any child was a blessing, a daughter could not inherit the titles or the estates. The pressure intensified, a physical weight in the cold castle air. Her husband, Adam Franz, began to spend more and more time away, drawn to the glittering heart of the empire, Vienna, and the endless political games of the imperial court. He was a favorite of the emperor, Charles VI, and the two men were inseparable, often seen hunting together on the imperial estates. Eleonora was left behind in Bohemia, a beautiful, lonely It was during this period of profound isolation that her health, never robust, began its slow, insidious decline. In 1709, another pregnancy ended in a devastating miscarriage, leaving her weaker and more grief-stricken than before. It was then that she turned, not to the court physicians who had failed her, but to folk remedies and healers, a decision that would later cast a sinister light on her memory. Desperate to conceive a son and cure her chronic ailments, she began to spend a fortune on esoteric treatments. 514. Her account books from this time list bizarre ingredients that sound like a witch's brew: crayfish eyes, powdered unicorn horn. In reality, the tusk of a gnarland, expensive tinctures from traveling alchemists. Most disturbing to the local peasantry was her fascination with wolves. Believing in an old superstition that the milk of a she-wolf could cure infertility, she kept a pack of them at one of her castles. A practice that horrified the servants who saw the wolf as a creature of the devil. 10. Here was a princess, consorting with beasts of the night, drinking their milk, and practicing what looked to the uneducated eye like dark magic. The whispers had found fertile ground. She was strange. She was barren. She consorted with wolves. While her husband caroused in Vienna, the lonely princess in Bohemia was slowly, unwittingly, building the pyre of her own reputation. The marriage deteriorated further when, in 1710, Adam Franz publicly accused her of infidelity. He claimed a servant had told him she had slept with a French officer while visiting her father. He never produced the accuser, and the story changed with each telling, but the mud stuck. Eleonora and her father denied the accusation vehemently, but the damage was done. 1. The humiliation was absolute. She was now not only a barren wife but a tainted one. Her isolation was complete, a prison of shame and suspicion. For years she lived in this limbo, a ghost in her own home, while her husband enjoyed the favor of the emperor. Then, in a sudden turn of fate, a vast inheritance fell to the Schwarzenberg family, making them wealthier and more powerful than ever. With this new security, the old grievances, including the dowry disputes and accusations of infidelity, were conveniently swept aside. A reconciliation of convenience was arranged. Eleonora was brought back to Vienna, back to the court, back to her husband's side, and then, a miracle. In 1722, after 21 years of marriage, at the age of 40, Eleonora gave birth to a son, Joseph Adam. The succession was secured. The dynasty was safe. It should have been a moment of ultimate triumph, a restoration of her honor and purpose. For a time, she was once again the celebrated Princess of Schwarzenberg. But the long years of sorrow, strange remedies, and emotional neglect had taken a profound toll. The happiness was fragile, a brief Indian summer before a long and brutal winter. Her health remained precarious. The joy of her son's birth was shattered a decade later by a bizarre and tragic event. In 1732, while on a hunt with the emperor, her husband, Adam Franz, accidentally stepped into the emperor's line of fire. 11. He was shot and died the next day. Eleonora was now a widow. As regent for her young son, she was responsible for managing the vast Schwarzenberg estates, a task she threw herself into with quiet competence. 5. But the shadows were gathering. The chronic illness that had plagued her for years returned with a vengeance. She grew gaunt, pale, and weak, suffering from constant, agonizing pain. She shunned the daylight, which seemed to amplify her suffering. Again, she turned to her strange folk remedies, spending vast sums on any healer who promised a cure. 5. To the servants who watched her, this was not a woman dying of a terrestrial disease. This was something else. This was a slow, horrifying transformation. Her appearance became frightening. She was skeletal. Her skin had a translucent, waxy pallor, and she seemed to subsist on nothing. This was the height of the vampire panic. 715. The word vampire had only recently entered the German and English languages, carried on the back of terrifying official reports from military surgeons on the Serbian frontier. 315. These were not romantic figures. They were bloated, foul revenants who spread plague and death. 3. People believed vampirism was a contagion, and they took gruesome steps to stop it, exhuming bodies and desecrating them with stakes. 6-8. In this climate of fear, a noblewoman in the capital, wasting away with a mysterious illness, who had long been associated with strange practices like drinking wolf's milk, was a terrifying figure. The stage was set for her final act. As she lay on her deathbed in Vienna in May of 1741, the city was buzzing with fear. Her death was not seen as a release from suffering, but as a potential threat to the public. The hasty autopsy, the discovery of the horrific internal tumor, and the bizarre, secretive burial all seemed to confirm the darkest suspicions. Why else would a princess of her stature be buried so far from her husband, in a remote chapel, under a stone that declared her a poor sinner? 7. The answer, to the terrified public, was obvious. The family was trying to contain her, to prevent her from rising again, to feast on the living. In the taverns and markets, the story grew with each telling. They said the wolves she had kept howled on her grave at night. They said the doctor who performed the autopsy fled the city in terror. They said her reflection could be seen floating on the river on moonless nights. History and fear had conspired to write a new, dark fairy tale. A lonely, tragic princess, failed by medicine, betrayed by her husband, and isolated by her grief, had her suffering twisted into a monstrous legend. Her true illness was erased, replaced by a supernatural curse. She was no longer Eleonora von Schwarzenberg. She had become, and would remain for centuries, the vampire princess. Her story serves as a chilling reminder of how easily the unknown can be twisted into the monstrous, and how the whispers of superstition can drown out the quiet truths of a forgotten life. The shadows of the past are long, and they often hide truths we are not prepared to see. The story of Eleonora is not just a Gothic tale. It is a story of how a woman's suffering can be rewritten by fear and ignorance. We are surrounded by such stories, by forgotten lives and misunderstood histories waiting in the dark corridors of the past. If you wish to walk these corridors with me, to uncover more of these hidden truths and give voice to those who have been silenced by time, then subscribe to this channel and join our gathering of wanderers. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Eleanor's tragic fate, and what other dark corners of history you wish for us to explore together. Until next time, stay curious and listen closely to the whispers of the past.